Hello and welcome. We are diving into a huge puzzle today, something that's popping up all over the globe, the rise of populism. I mean, it seems to be happening everywhere, but the real question is, why? So let's see if we can crack this case together.
Right. So why now? And why in so many different countries at pretty much the same time? We're going to treat this whole thing like a detective story. We'll look at the main suspects, the big theories, and try to figure out what is really going on here. Okay, first up in our lineup is a classic suspect. This theory says the real reason for all this isn't about politics or money, not really. It's something, deeper, more social and psychological. It goes by the name of the mass society thesis. The basic idea here is that as our societies get more and more modern, the traditional things that used to bind us together, tight-knit local communities, maybe churches, labor unions, they all start to fade away. And that can leave a lot of us feeling kind of isolated, a little adrift. So here's how that works. This feeling of disconnection, sociologists have a word for it, anomie. It makes people feel powerless. And when you feel powerless, you start looking for a new tribe, a new group to belong to. And that's the perfect moment for a charismatic leader to swoop in and offer a really simple, really powerful identity. We are the people. And to make that identity even stronger, you define it against a common enemy, some corrupt, out-of-touch elite. All right, let's bring in our second major suspect. This theory kind of tosses the psychology out the window and says the answer is much more straightforward. It's about money, it's about jobs, and it's about power. The way this theory sees it, voters aren't just having some emotional reaction. Nope, they're making pretty calculated decisions based on what's best for them, for their wallets. If the system isn't delivering, well, they're going to start looking for an alternative. It's a rational choice, not some psychological tick. And this theory points to a few really specific drivers. First, you've got the folks who've been left behind by globalization. Then you've got governments that people see as corrupt or just plain unresponsive. And maybe most critically, you have mainstream political parties that just seem to be ignoring all these problems, which creates this huge vacuum, this perfect opening for a populist challenger to step right in and say, hey, I see you, I hear you. So let's put our two main suspects side by side. The mass society thesis says the problem is social disconnection and that voters are really just looking for an identity. But the economic thesis, it says the problem is a broken system and voters are making a smart, strategic choice. One's about the heart, the other is all about the wallet. Okay, so we've heard the case for both sides. Is it the lonely crowd looking for meaning, or is it the failing economy pushing people to act? Which one of these theories actually solves our mystery? Well, this is where our detective story gets a plot twist. Because while both of these theories are pretty compelling and they both explain part of the puzzle, they also share a massive blind spot. See, they can tell us why people might be unhappy, but they don't really explain why they choose populism specifically as the answer. And that missing piece, it's the ideas, the power of the populist message itself. Neither of those first two theories really gets to grips with the core ideas of populism, this intense, almost black and white story of the pure, common people versus a corrupt and conniving elite. And that leads us to a real breakthrough, a newer theory that kind of combines the strengths of the others, but fills in that huge gap. It's called the ideational theory, and as the name suggests, it puts the focus squarely on the ideas themselves. What this theory suggests is that populist feelings aren't just created out of nowhere by economic trouble or social loneliness. Instead, they're more like dormant beliefs and attitudes about democracy that many of us already have. Especially this core idea that the will of the people is the most important thing. Those feelings are just, well, they're waiting to be switched on. This is a fantastic way to think about it. The potential for populism is already wired into the very foundation of how we think about democracy. That belief in power to the people, that's the wiring. A crisis, either economic or social, creates the right conditions. But you still need a politician, a political entrepreneur, to come along and actually flip that switch. So how does this activation actually happen? Well, it tends to build in a few steps. First, you have those latent attitudes just sitting there, that widespread belief in the will of the people. Second, you need a context, like a big corruption scandal or a painful recession, something that makes it really look like the elites have failed. Third, a leader comes along and frames that failure not just as a mistake, but as a deliberate betrayal, pitching it as the people versus the corrupt elite. And boom. Fourth, that framing hits the switch,
and those dormant populist feelings are activated into a powerful political movement.
So, after all that, what's the final verdict in our investigation? Well, this ideational theory, it doesn't just solve the puzzle, it completely reframes it. And honestly, this changes everything about how we need to think about populism.
And here's why this is such a game changer. It finally explains why populism can show up in any democracy, whether it's rich or poor, left-wing or right-wing, because that core belief in the will of the people is universal in a democracy. It also solves the timing puzzle, why these attitudes are everywhere, but successful movements are actually pretty rare. You need that perfect storm to activate them. And maybe most importantly, it makes it clear that the real grievance often isn't just about economic pain. It's about a deep sense of moral betrayal, a feeling that the elites have broken a sacred democratic promise.
There's this quote from the research that just perfectly captures the big takeaway here. Populism isn't some weird alien disease that attacks democracy from the outside. It's an inherent part of democracy itself, a kind of shadow that's always there, precisely because of democracy's core belief in the power of the people. It's a pathological normalcy. And that really leaves us with one final massive question. If we accept that populism isn't a bug but a permanent feature of democratic life, what do we do about it? How do we manage its challenges and address the very real grievances it often points to without undermining the whole idea of the people's will? That right there is the real puzzle we're all trying to solve now. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.